Web payments is simply building interoperability between different payment networks. Payment networks, there are traditional payment networks like the credit card companies. We've got traditional payment systems such as checks. How do you build interoperability between these different payment networks? There's a lot to be learned by drawing an analogy with the internet, which is the interoperability between networks themselves. So web payments is trying to build interoperability into the traditional payment networks and the new payment networks to come. So we have very innovative companies like Alibaba and Tencent meeting with very traditional institutions like Federal Bank or the US Federal Reserve, and we're trying to come up with, again, a common language, for example, payer and payee, that is relatively agnostic with respect to the settlement numeraire. You can have web payment where you can pay by US dollar, RMB, Hong Kong dollar, Bitcoin, whatever, Litecoin, what have you. The payment unit doesn't matter. What matters is that these networks, these different payment networks, are interoperable. So the way it works is that we develop use cases, right? We imagine how different payment networks, what needs to cross one payment network into another, and how to make that as frictionless as possible. Once you can do that, then you can exchange value from one network to a separate network and build different kinds of ecosystems for consumers to have trust on doing business over the internet. How do you build that? Well, you build off existing trust infrastructure, such as the banks, existing trust infrastructure, such as the credit card company, existing trust infrastructure, such as mobile phone companies. So what's interesting here is that, I think for the first time, we have what's called a multi-stakeholder view, where everyone has their private interest, commercial or otherwise, and yet there is common ground that can be found. Why? Because the value of reducing costs for everyone is there. The interesting thing with the web payments work and the traditional standards work like the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, when you realize that the market opportunity is the growth of a huge market where everyone can compete as you should for a faster slice of a rapidly growing pie, that's in everyone's interest to do that. So web payments is a way of trying to develop common standards so that areas like fintech, which is exploding, right? We have multiple, different payment mechanisms, arguably perhaps too many, that are very confusing for the consumer. To have them make the consumer experience pleasant, make sure that their privacy is maintained, and make sure that it's secure. Ultimately, it will be an issue of consumer choice and value proposition to the consumer, regardless of which the consumer ultimately will choose what are the preferred payment mechanisms. And you want the consumer to be able to determine that. At the same time, the merchant may have its own preferred payment receipt. Then maybe they prefer to receive RMB or US dollar, whereas the person who's paying wants to pay perhaps in Bitcoin. So again, how do you reduce the friction so that the person who pays can pay and the payee can receive the value seamlessly? So that's currently the problem with the existing architecture, is that we sprinkle our private information, our credit card data all over the internet in larger and larger groups, right? And then when there are security breaches, then these security breaches are becoming increasingly larger and larger. And so the new architecture is completely opposite, which is that it's gone from basically pull payments, whereby you give your payment details where the merchant has the right to pull money from your account, to something called a push payment model, which is I, as the buyer, have to demonstrate that I've pushed money into the merchant's account, and I provide a cryptographically secure way of proving that. It's a completely different way of viewing the flow of payments. And these are the kinds of innovations that are changes in architecture, that you don't have a single point of failure. That if you do have a failure, the risk of that failure is localized. So you avoid systemically important financial institutions or single points of failure. You avoid that through architecture. That's why it's very important to come up and understand that the new governance models, the new technical models, are entirely distributed in nature and distributed by design, whereas traditional trust is centralized through registries, where you can view banks as being a registry for their own books. And they put a lot of technology to make sure that the people who be able to write to that ledger, that book, is only them, and that they write correct things. So the web payments not only is interesting because, again, over the last 4 years, we've come up with some very important concepts. These concepts have been, I think, more or less accepted as being the new way of designing these trust networks. Again, it's not a hierarchy. That's a new way of trying to engineer trust in the digital age, and that's why it's important for places like Hong Kong, where we are trusted, to build on the trust that we have and evolve for the future.